So, taking a momentary break from all the discussion about log profiles and color science stuff, I wanted to talk a little bit today about another lens aberration, focus ramping. Now, I first ran into or heard of this back when I first started out in photography, and specifically when I was playing around with macro photography. But the reality is I haven't thought about it in ages. Then I ran across a video recently from Ari, where Art Adams, their representative in the video, was talking about the exposure accuracy of Ari's signature lenses regardless of focus distance, and he started talking about this. What he was noticing was that when he compared Ari's lenses to competing brands, focused at the same normal working distances, 6 or so feet, let's just say, lenses with the same t-stop would have different exposures. And in fact, you don't have to be a director of photography working for Ari to have noticed this as a phenomenon. As I said, it's a well-known phenomenon in macro photography. Macro photographers for years have had to do calculations to compensate for this when shooting manual cameras that didn't do through the lens metering and so forth. And you can't even run into it with like regular mirrorless hybrid lenses. Now, if you've never tried to match exposures between cameras in a video shoot or done that kind of macro photography, then this may all be news to you. And this is a doubly true thing since TTL metering, which almost all of our cameras do, takes care of adjusting for this for you automatically. It just shifts the exposure as necessary. So, why am I talking about this all of a sudden? Why come back to this? Well, the reality is I ran into this working on a video deep diving into Canon's log gamma curves. Instead of just relying on my camera's meter, I was also using a Sekonic L308 incident meter, since that meter is accurate to 1/10 of a stop instead of the camera's third stop steps. And lo and behold, if I dialed the meter setting into the camera, I would get a different exposure than what I was expecting in the conditions that I was testing in. And this wasn't a case of like, well, f-stops aren't t-stops, there's a difference there. We were talking in some cases at close focusing distances of more than a stop or close to a stop, not a third or less. Now, of course, Art, in his discussion on Ari's channel, wasn't seeing this at macro magnifications, and while I was certainly working at closer distances than Art was, I wasn't at macro level either. But the reality is this isn't just a macro problem. So what exactly is going on here? Why does this happen? Well, for a lens to focus on something closer than infinitely far away, we have to move that lens away from the sensor or film plane. This is why an overall extending lens, like this 50mm f1.8, extends. Now, since we know lenses move away from the sensor to focus, the question then becomes, can we predict how much, and more importantly, how much darkening that will cause? And again, the answer here is yes. Of course we can. We start by figuring out how much these lenses have to shift to focus at any given subject distance. Thanks to Newton and Gauss, we can use this equation, Gauss specifically here, to calculate the image distance for any given focal length lens at any given object distance, so how far away you're focusing, basically. Now, I should note, this isn't completely correct for our lenses for several reasons. One being that we almost always measure subject distance when talking about it in photography from the camera's film plane and not the lens's first principal point where Gauss's equations do. And secondly, because we don't know how much null space between the first and second principal points in the lens there is. Now, we could, of course, measure that and get a more accurate number, but for our purposes here, I'm going to accept that my approximations are just that, approximations, and move on with my life, basically. So given Gauss's equation, and a subject, say 6 feet away or 1.83 meters, we can calculate that the lens has to move from the camera away from the camera by about 1.4 millimeters. Now, how do we use that to figuring out an exposure change? There are two explanations for this phenomenon, although ultimately it's all the same explanation, it's just coming at it from different perspectives. One is that the aperture value changes because the effective focal length changes when focusing and the aperture stop doesn't. The other is that this is simply a product of the inverse square law. In reality, it's product of the inverse square law, and both of them are seeing the same thing. In any event, ultimately, both approaches are, as I said, looking at the same thing from different perspectives, and they'll both ultimately give you the same results. But the reality is one approach may be more useful for you in some situations than others. Now, in this case, I'm going to look at the raw sensor values, or I was looking at raw sensor values to determine exposure changes. And having a percentage difference in linear raw sensor value terms instead of a logarithmic aperture value change is more useful for me. So that's the math I'm going to do first to explain this. And then at the end of this video, I'll show you how the aperture compensation approach works and how that all ties in. Now, since we're dealing with the inverse square law, we end up with something that looks like this equation. In this equation, f is the focal length, e is the amount of extension, and s prime is the image distance. Now, in our case, we had a 50mm lens focused at 6 feet, which from Gauss's equation tells us that the image distance was 51.4 millimeters. So plugging it into this equation, we get the change in a change in brightness of 94.63%. Now, predictions and math are great, but it has to play out in the real world. So let's go test it. So the test setup, this is actually pretty straightforward, at least as far as many of these kinds of things goes. Since we only care about brightness or the brightness of an evenly illuminated field, we need some diffusion and a diffuse light source. Though technically, diffusion over the lens coupled with a stable shooting platform so the scene can't change and a constrained central measurement would also actually be sufficient. Now, for diffusion, all I did was cut a piece of vellum paper to fit in a standard 4-inch filter holder and clipped it in place over the lens. For a light source, I set up an Amaran 150C RGB LED in a 24-inch square double diffused softbox to make it as soft as possible. I set my camera to ISO 100, picked an aperture towards the wide open end of my lens, I think it was like 2.8 on an f1.8 lens, and then adjusted the shutter speed and light to get a meter reading that was about 2 1/3 to 2 2/3 stops above the normal 18% reading. Now, that's the easy part of the setup. The tricky part of this setup is actually the focus distance, or at least doing anything accurately with them. This is doubly challenging for me as a Canon user, as Canon uses the infinity focus point for temperature compensation. So their lenses are designed to focus past infinity so that when they're hot or cold, you always get infinity focus. Moreover, like almost all mirrorless platforms at this point as well, Canon has removed distance scales from their lenses. And while the camera does store and show focus distances in both the metadata and in the live view, reality is that's not terribly accurate. So with that in mind, for the infinity test, I simply focused the lens at the infinity stop. Now, yes, I understand that this is past infinity and therefore will be a source of error in all of these testings. For the close focus case, I measured out about 6 feet to a wall with a tape measure and then focused on the wall standing at the end of the tape measure to approximate that. Made an image in each case, and with the 2 raw images at hand, I brought them into Raw Digger and used the average of a 250 by 250 pixel section centered in the middle of the frame, and then looked at the values that I had on the green one channel. That gave me about 62,500 data points to average together, which seemed fairly good from a noise rejection perspective. Now for the infinity image, I got an average of 3,184.1, and for the 6-foot image, I got 3,029.2. That translates to a 4.8% loss in brightness from focusing from infinity to approximately 6 feet away. If we calculate the percent error from this and the predicted 6.63% loss that we came up with earlier, that's just 0.5%, which, quite honestly, given how uncontrolled this test was, I find to be incredibly impressive. Given that, knowing that this actually works as well as it does, I repeated the test a second time at approximately 3 feet because, well, some people would say that it's not science unless you do it twice. At 3 feet, the prediction is that I should see 89.4% of the light that I had at infinity focus. And the measured results were 89.8%. Again, an error of about 0.5%, which, again, given how little effort I'm putting into getting the focus distances right, is actually quite surprising to me. In fact, with these two tests in hand, knowing again that all of this works, I sat down and wrote some code to calculate the predicted and measured exposure changes, and then shot a full depth of field focus stack with this lens and to see how the curves matched, and these are the results. Yeah. The measured curve almost neatly takes the prediction straight on right through the entire focus range. Now, all that said, these results raise a good question, at least they did in my mind. This is a simple lens. It just extends all of the optical elements when focusing. What happens in the cases of more complex lenses? After all, we know that increasing the focal length, the effective focal length, by focusing, as is being done in the lens here, also causes the lens's angle of view to change. In this case, since the focal length gets longer, the angle of view gets narrower. That particular aberration, that change in angle of view, is often called breathing, and it is a big problem when shooting video where there are focus changes while the camera is recording. In fact, I did a whole series of videos on breathing where I tested basically every Canon EF and RF lens that I could get my hands on or that I had access to. And if you're interested in that, I have a playlist linked in all the usual places to those videos. Anyway, the one thing that fell out of those tests was that not all lenses breathe the same, either in magnitude or direction, depending on how it's actually designed and built. So far, we've looked at a lens that extends, moves all of the optical elements when it's focused. But these lenses increase their focal length and therefore narrow their angle of view when focusing closer, and they do so very predictably by that Gauss's equation, essentially. However, most lenses built today are not this design. They use internal or rear focusing mechanisms. Now, these lenses are great for us as photographers since they don't extend when focusing, and that's just kind of annoying. But how that internal or rear focusing mechanism affects the angle of view and potentially now light loss is no longer easily predictable with some centuries-old optical equations. For example, on this Canon RF 24-70 f2.8L IS USM, the angle of view gets wider when focusing closer to the camera at short focal length, so for example 24 millimeters. But at the long end, at 70 millimeters, that effect is reversed and the image actually gets tighter. So the only thing we can do with these kinds of lenses is test them and see how they behave. So let's do that. Using the same setup and software that I used previously, I set up my RF 24-70 f2.8L IS USM and ran a full range test from 24, 35, 50, and 70 millimeter zoom positions. These graphs show the result. At 24, 35, and 50 millimeters, the lens is actually brighter than it should be compared to the infinity focus position, probably due to the angle of view getting wider. At 24 millimeters, it's almost an eighth stop brighter at the minimum focus distance, though at 35 and 50, the error is just under a 32nd of stop, so it does decrease there. At 70 millimeters, where the angle of view shift reverses, the lens is just under an eighth stop darker at the minimum focus distance than it is at infinity. So that raises a very good question. What can you do about this? And maybe more importantly, how much of a problem is it practically speaking? To the latter point first, I haven't tested all of my lenses, but for the couple I have, consistency is far better than I actually expected. We're talking about internal zoom or internal focusing lenses. In fact, surprisingly, my RF 28-70 f2L USM, which has some of the worst angle of view shift or breathing that I have measured in any of the lenses I tested, shows almost no change in exposure with focusing. And the RF 24-70 f2.8L IS USM's worst case is less than a third of a stop, almost unconfigurable or irrelevant when talking about exposure adjustments. So again, how do we deal with this? Well, first answer is that you might really not have to at all. I mean, depending on the lens and ultimately the standards that you're working to, you may find that the exposures are fine right out of the camera and that everything is perfectly fine. Barring that, the next solution that you might want to look into is fixing this in post. A little bit of lift or gain or whatever on your image and you have matching brightnesses. But what if you don't want to just fix it in post? Well, if you're a Canon shooter, you can get exposures much closer in Canon. Both Canon cinema cameras and their hybrid cameras support fine aperture adjustments just for this purpose, and this is really what that setting is made for. On Canon hybrid cameras, you can enable the fine aperture adjustments through the red shooting menu. The setting is called AV 1/8 stop increments, and it's found somewhere on either page 2 or page 3 of the menu. On the R5, you'll find it on page 2. On the R5 Mark II, it's on page 3. When enabled, at least on the latest firmware for the R5 and R5 Mark II, the camera displays the aperture value in eighth stop increments in the live view as you are working. Now, you won't, when you're doing this, see the 1/3 or 1/2 stop increments, so that's something to keep in mind. If you're used to settings like 4.5, that would end up being 4 3/8 now. On the R5C and other Canon cinema cameras, this setting is called fine increments, and it's found on page 1 of the camera setup menu. Fine increments on the cinema cameras adjusts the aperture in either 1/8 stop steps when you have EF lenses mounted on the camera or 1/32 stop steps when you have RF lenses mounted on the camera. Now, unfortunately, this setting is a bit of a usability disaster. Unlike the hybrid cameras, the cinema cameras don't change how the aperture setting is displayed. While the camera ignores the iris increment setting and always displays in third stop increments, it also rounds your fine aperture value to the nearest third stop. So f4, for example, actually starts at 5/32 of a stop before f4 and ends 5/32 of a stop after f4, but all of those report as f4 on the display. Moreover, there's no indication whether you're at or when you're at the actual f4 setting, without at least not paying really close attention to how many clicks you've made on the aperture dial as you've made the adjustment. It would also be nice if there was an 8th stop increment mode for everything on the cinema cameras. Some of us might want to match the exposure more accurately, but just don't need a 32nd of a level or a stop amount of precision. Now, with that all said, I said I'd talk about the effective aperture approach at the end of this video, and well, this is the end of the video. The equation for that approach is this, where AV sub E is the effective aperture, AV sub I is the set or reported aperture, F is the focal length, E is the amount of extension, and as usual, S prime is the image distance. Now, just like in the inverse square law case, we're calculating a ratio of the actual image distance and to the focal length. However, this time you'll notice that I've inverted that ratio, or this ratio is actually inverted. This is done since the aperture values get larger as the aperture gets darker or smaller. So f4 to f5.6 is a stop darker, not a stop brighter. You'll also notice here that we're not squaring this adjustment ratio. This is because the aperture values already take the inverse square law into account as a product of their definition. That is, the f number is the focal length divided by the diameter of the entrance pupil. As a result, and ignoring transmission losses, all lenses set to the same aperture value transmit the same amount of light regardless of the focal length. The diameter of the aperture just has to be bigger. In any case, we do the same calculation here as we did previously. For our 50mm lens shot at f4, focused at 1.83 meters, the calculation says that the increase is just under a 32nd of an aperture value step. Now we need to convert this to a linear light loss percentage for our calculations and invert our correction factor, since we want darker things to have a factor less than 1, and then we also have to convert the difference from f-stop increments to stops and then to linear stuff. The way we do this is by converting our aperture setting error into stops. And so for this case, what we're going to do is we're going to invert our function, or our error function. So we're going to go from the object distance, or the focal length plus the extension, over the focal length to the focal length over the image distance. We're then going to take the log base of the square root of 2 of that to get the change in aperture units in stops. Finally, we're going to take 2 raised to the power of the value that we just calculated to get the percent change in linear terms. So let's put this into practice for our simple case. We have an aperture number adjustment factor of 1.028, the reciprocal of which is 0.972763. This translates from aperture value adjustments to aperture, or to stops, to a change of minus 0.079681 stops, which raising 2 to the power of translates to a linear change of 0.946267, or 94.6267% of the original brightness, which is what we got using the inverse square law calculation at the beginning. So that brings me to this end of this little side quest. My intention now is that over the next several weeks, I'd like to test the rest of my lenses and see how they perform. I'd also like to look into the effects of peripheral brightness correction and other optical aberration corrections to see if they're doing anything of any note to this effect when, for example, shooting video. Now, I may also revisit this in the context of Canon log formats, as the error in brightness may also be squashed to a certain extent by the Canon log exposure jumps, or the way the log curves work, but we'll talk about that in another video. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button, or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.